Good evening, or good afternoon, or good morning, whenever you're watching APUSH Nation. This is our last Fireside chat of February, and I want to get right to it. And we're going to do a whip around. So as many different topics and as much information as I can give you is going to be crammed into here. And the goal is to do it in under 20 minutes. So let's get to it. Let's talk first about the Spanish flu. Even World War I and its 8.5 million deaths could not match nearly the devastation of the Spanish flu. An aggressive strand of a bird flu that mutated with a pig virus that eventually caught in France during the war actually spread to every corner and every region of the globe. By the end of the Spanish flu's reign, which it really only lasted about a year from 1918 to 1919, the Spanish flu would kill anywhere from 50 to 100 million people. Now, why is the range there so broad? Because it's hard to know exactly in some regions of the world what the true cause of death was. But what historians and what scientists do know is that what caused such absolutely mind-boggling statistics of death, we're talking 3 to 5% of the world's population was wiped out due to this disease. And I'm going to go a little science on you here because some of you will probably get this term. But what made this virus so unique and so deadly is the fact that, number one, it actually killed young people. Usually diseases hit children or the elderly the hardest. But the people who most suffered the Spanish flu, ironically, in the sense that they were the same people who suffered so great during World War I, were people your age and my age. So really about 17 to 18 to 40 was where the largest number of deaths came from. And the main reason was the disease in its mutations attacked the immune system in what you would call a cytokine. I hope I'm pronouncing that right. Maybe you guys know what I'm talking about. But when you have an overreaction of the immune system, it ends up breaking down a lot faster. And that's what made the Spanish flu so deadly. In the United States in particular, the flu came and spread and began in Kansas at an army camp. So soldiers inevitably brought the disease back with them from France. And in the United States, I mean, you had thousands of people dying daily during the virus's reign, which lasted from about 1918 to 1919. And, you know, this is one of those situations you wonder, why the heck do people not talk so much about this as being one of the great calamities in world history? And if you think about the context, you know, it's just after the war. People were pretty numb by then to the number of death tolls and the reports, and it was sort of sometimes indistinguishable as to whether or not they were dying in battle or they were dying from a flu or what the cause was. And people were so focused on the horrors of trench warfare and the war itself that the flu just didn't grab as much attention. And it also didn't last very long. It only lasted about a year in terms of how before scientists were able to sort of figure out a way to fight it. Woodrow Wilson did Woodrow Wilson did catch the flu while he was in Paris for the peace conference, but he did not die from the Spanish flu, but it did contribute to his weakening health. No matter what, this is without a doubt for the United States the worst virus, the most deadly biological disaster in human history, and United States history for that matter too. Now I mentioned Wilson, who suffered a stroke shortly after returning from Paris and really struggled the last few years of his life. But 1919, the year after the war, is actually a remarkable period in U.S. history. There's just so much that goes on in the immediacy following the war. And I'm first going to talk about one of the most sweeping provisions ever added to the Constitution, which was the 18th Amendment, the amendment to ban the sale of alcohol in the United States, a.k.a. the Prohibition Amendment. Now, Prohibition was not a novel concept at the end of World War I. Now, think about where we've already talked about Prohibition earlier this year. The temperance movement was a social reform movement that dates back to the mid-1800s and carried on into the progressive era, especially with women's rights groups. And ultimately, it was Protestant groups, Midwestern Protestants from the West, are very rigid in their conservative Christian values, that influenced the addition of the Prohibition 18th Amendment. And with that, the United States would eventually spend the rest of the 1920s as a dry country, meaning there was no sale of alcohol throughout the United States. However, in the immediacy of the passage of the 18th Amendment, Congress had to beef up its law enforcement agencies and give them an armed mechanism to fight and enforce the 18th Amendment. And that's where you get the Volstead Act, Volstead. The Volstead Act was sort of the teeth of the Prohibition Amendment. So that's what gave law enforcement agents the ability to prosecute and go after bootleggers or moonshiners or organized crime who were importing alcohol into the United States from places like Canada or Mexico or anywhere else they can get their hands on it. But it's really hard to believe that throughout the entire decade of the 1920s and into the 1930s, the United States was a dry country, meaning it was illegal to purchase or have alcohol. But that doesn't mean people stopped. People had ways to get it. Moonshining, I mentioned that term before, was common. People would make it in their tubs, in their house, wherever they could, and would then sell it on the black market to bootleggers who would carry the alcohol across state lines and sell it under extreme danger of being caught by law enforcement agencies. But perhaps Prohibition is one of the most important legacies of the progressive era. You have an amendment to the Constitution before women even gained the right to vote, right? Because that's the 19th Amendment. Before women even gained the right to vote, you've got an amendment to the Constitution banning alcohol, and that is much in credit due to the progressives and very much due to the influence of Protestant groups, especially in the Midwest and West, where Protestantism was very much entrenched in the United States. So Prohibition is here to stay temporarily, and it will be a theme throughout the entire 1920s. Now, speaking of law enforcement, I really want to go into a remarkable period of 3-month gap in U.S. history from November 1919 to January 1920 that really set the stage for the birth of our modern-day FBI. At the time, the Department of Justice, which is actually what houses the FBI, the Department of Justice, the head of that department is the Attorney General of the United States. And the man serving in that position at the end of 1919, the final year of Woodrow Wilson's presidency, was Alexander Mitchell Palmer. And he was sometimes just called A. Mitchell Palmer. 1919 was a volatile year in the United States. And with the wake of World War I, with tension with labor unions, which we're going to talk about later on here, also, race riots were occurring throughout the country. We're going to get into that on Monday in class, actually. Law enforcement agencies were basically at the end, on the brink of dealing with all this tension. So you also have a growing sense of anarchists, which are already a strong group within the United States. You've got your industrialists, your leftists. The Bolshevik Revolution is going on in Russia, and a Communist Party of America was formed in 1919. So there's all this there's this strange mixture of radicals who are gaining momentum. And within the United States, there's this growing fear that radicals are plotting a conspiracy to overtake the government. Well, that conspiracy actually came to fruition when the Attorney General, who I already mentioned, A. Mitchell Palmer, when bombs were placed. One bomb was placed and mailed to his home in 1919, and numerous other bomb threats were occurring to law enforcement agencies in the Department of Justice, and this prompted an unbelievable response by the Department of Justice to the fact that in that 3-year gap that I mentioned, where this tension really boiled to a point, November 1919 to January 1920, 500 foreigners were deported by the United States government for their alleged role in what were now called Palmer raids. And the Palmer raids were basically where the Attorney General's office broke into labor union offices. They made numerous arrests of labor union leaders, leftists, radicals, anarchists, and they used an incredible sense of power from the federal government to bust up numerous unions, to bust up socialist groups, and as I mentioned, ended up deporting 500 people out of the country. All told, there are about 10,000 people who were arrested in this Palmer Raids initiative, and that's what they were called, the Palmer Raids, because A. Mitchell Palmer organized and set up this aggressive measure by the United States government. Now, a lot of historians label the Palmer Raids as really the beginning of the Red Scare in the United States. And if you know that term at all, or if you don't know that term, whenever you hear Red Scare, you want to think of fear of communism. That's going to become a pervasive attitude throughout the 1920s and going into, obviously, the 1930s and beyond. But the Palmer Raids were really a great example of how fear of communism, fear of anarchists and leftists led to a rash of arrests nationwide, with thousands of people put behind bars and hundreds deported out of the country for their alleged association with not just the bombing of the Attorney General, but also, like I mentioned, labor groups and anarchist groups. And the Palmer Raids, what you want to take away from this little section here is that the context of the Palmer Raids is absolutely that it triggered the first wave of a Red Scare in the United States. Now, I mentioned that one of the groups that were being targeted in the Palmer Raids were union groups. And despite the fact that unions, for the most part, stood up to assist the federal government during the war for production, and the cooperation between the two sides was strongly supported by the National Labor Relations Board, labor union strikes became a common theme in the years after World War I. The two I want to focus on quickly are what was called the Great Steel Strike of 1919, very similar to the Great Railroad Strike of 1877, when railroad workers nationwide went on strike. Violence, death were themes of those. But in the Great Steel Strike of 1919, 350,000 steel workers went on strike in the United States, halting our steel production and bringing the federal government and union workers closely again intermixed in conflict. So that's one example of a large-scale strike that occurred in the years after World War I. But I'm going to talk to you about one that should grab your attention even more, and that was the West Virginia Coal Wars. That's what this was called. That involved coal miners in unions in West Virginia. The Battle of Blair Mountain was the largest labor union uprising in this country's history, hands down. For about 5 days in 1921, August 1921, about 10,000 coal miners armed themselves and confronted about 3,000 law enforcement agencies in West Virginia. This was the largest, I repeat, the largest well-armed uprising in the United States since the Civil War. When the battle ended after about 5 days of conflict between union workers and the coal miners versus the law enforcement agencies, 1 million rounds were fired. 1 million rounds. All told, there were over 100 people killed and almost 1,000 people arrested for their involvement in the Battle of Blair Mountain. Please make sure, look, I give you a lot of examples throughout the year so that you obviously can hopefully use these on your essays and short answers. But this would be a great example that would really impress an AP grader. So the Battle of Blair Mountain, of all the labor union strikes we've talked about, is the largest, deadliest, and most controversial in terms of the struggle that it ensued in. And ultimately, the United States Army was sent in to intervene by presidential order. And who was president in 1921? Well, if you guessed Warren Harding, then clearly you were correct. And that means you must have read Blink in Honors English Language, because if you read Blink in Honors English Language, you know that Warren Harding, who was voted president in 1920, after a somewhat undistinguishable career as a politician in Ohio, Warren Harding absolutely demolished James Cox in the election of 1920. By the way, James Cox's vice president, I'm not sure if anybody knew this, Franklin D. Roosevelt. Kind of interesting. Harding won the electoral vote 37 states to 11, so it was a pretty sweeping victory for Harding. Why should you care about Warren Harding's victory? This was now a Republican takeover. A Republican takeover. The Republicans had slowly lost their prominence in politics due to Woodrow Wilson's rise to power. But with Warren Harding's victory in 1920, we're going to look at 3 consecutive Republicans in the White House. And the Republican Party will dominate, absolutely dominate presidential politics throughout the entire 1920s. I'm not going to go into too much on here about Harding. We'll talk more about some events in his presidency. He was a senator from Ohio, and as Malcolm Gladwell's book talked about in Blink, he was voted according to Gladwell. So take it for what that is worth. One of the theories about his popularity was he just was a very impressive figure, and we'll get into a little bit about his presidency in class. So Warren Harding is elected president in 1920, and he will come to the White House. And as I mentioned, the tie back into the Battle of Blair Mountain is that Warren Harding sent in the United States Army to intervene in that labor strike. But as I keep mentioning, we'll spend more on Harding before or at the end of next week. The last section here before we finish, I want to talk about a Supreme Court case that addresses the First Amendment, a pivotal Supreme Court case called Schenck versus United States. I'll spell it for you here. Schenck, Schenck versus United States. The Schenck versus United States case actually came on the heels of World War I. Last week we talked a great deal about the protest groups that were prosecuted under the Espionage Act in 1917. People who obstructed the draft and who spoke out against the draft were often jailed under the Espionage Act. But Schenck, who was Charles Schenck, who was one of the people that was arrested, actually sued, and they appealed all the way up to the Supreme Court, argued their First Amendment rights were violated. However, the Supreme Court ruled in Schenck v. United States that in a time, and here's the key line you want to get down, in a time of clear and present danger, the First Amendment may be infringed upon. And what that does establish here, folks, is that it certainly in the context of World War I, where the government was arresting people for speaking out against enlistment or recruiting for the military and the draft, this gave the federal government strength in its position to arrest and to go after people who presented a clear and present danger. And that term remains very much embedded in other future Supreme Court cases where you get into the matter of national security versus citizens' rights. So Schenck v. United States is a case that ultimately solidifies the government's position on the matter of national security at the time. So there you have it. We whipped around. We looked at a lot of different topics. The reading that you're going to have is going to get us going on race. We're going to go back to look at what's been going on in the Jim Crow South. We're going to talk also a great deal about the Great Migration, a topic that is really fascinating because I'm going to use some art. And we're going to actually do a lot of pop culture this week because, as I mentioned, this is really the era where pop culture was born in the United States. So I know this is a longer version of the Fireside Chat. I hope the Whiparound helps. Feel free to ask questions. I'll be sending in my email later on with the reading as well, my tutoring hours for next week. Have a great rest of your guys' weekend. I hope you enjoy tomorrow or tonight, whatever you're up to. And I'll see you guys on Monday. The past always shapes the future.